An elderly woman in a red dress falls on the marble floor of New York's most exclusive restaurant. Millionaire clients laugh. Servers watch and do nothing. Then, a 26-year-old waitress drops her $120 plates and runs to help her, losing her job instantly. But when a man in a $5,000 suit storms through the door desperately searching for his mother, everyone realizes they just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because that confused old lady they ignored? She's the mother of America's most powerful billionaire. And the poor waitress who helped her? She's about to have her entire life transformed in ways nobody could imagine. What city are you watching this video from and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. The Golden Pearl restaurant was the most exclusive in New York City, a temple of haute cuisine where a meal cost as much as a month's rent. That November night, when the elderly lady in the red dress slipped on the marble floor, the silence was deafening. Everyone looked at her. Millionaire clients, suited servers, the manager himself. But no one moved. She was old, out of place in that 3 Michelin star establishment. Probably some poor woman who had entered by mistake. Then, Emily Carter, 26 years old, precarious server on her 3rd day of work, dropped the tray she was carrying and ran to help her. The laughter was immediate. The manager reprimanded her. The rich clients looked at her with contempt. But when the man in the $5,000 Armani suit entered the restaurant desperately searching for his mother, and his eyes fell on the scene, everyone understood they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because that elderly lady in red was Margaret Morrison, mother of Christopher Morrison, CEO of Morrison Empire Group. And Emily had just saved the most important person in the life of the most powerful man in America. The Golden Pearl restaurant gleamed like a jewel in the heart of New York City, on the top floor of a glass building overlooking 5th Avenue. 3 Michelin stars, 6-month waiting list, clientele that included Hollywood actors, New York Yankees players, and industry magnates. The tasting menu cost $450 per person, without drinks. Servers had to have impeccable resumes and speak at least 3 languages. It was a place where everything was perfect, controlled, exclusive. Emily Carter should never have been there. 26 years old, hospitality school diploma, but no experience in luxury restaurants. She had been hired only because one of the servers had suddenly quit and they urgently needed staff for Fashion Week. It was her 3rd day and she felt like a fish out of water, among colleagues who looked at her condescendingly, as if her presence lowered the tone of the establishment. That November night, the restaurant was at full capacity. 90 covers, all reserved weeks in advance. There was a major fashion show, and many guests were designers, stylists, models. The atmosphere was electric. The service had to be impeccable. Emily moved nervously between tables, terrified of making mistakes. Her colleagues, servers with years of experience, moved with a grace she could only envy. It was around 9 o'clock when it happened. An elderly woman, perhaps 75 years old, entered the restaurant. She wore a fire-red dress that clashed with the sober elegance of the environment, shoes with heels too high for her age, a vintage purse that had seen better days. Her white hair was pulled back in a somewhat disheveled bun. She seemed confused, disoriented. The maitre d', Mr. Castellano, a 50-year-old man with a perfectly groomed mustache and a perpetually disdainful expression, stopped her immediately. Where did she think she was going? Did she have a reservation? The woman stammered something about her son, about an appointment, but her words were confused. The maitre d' told her dryly that without a reservation she couldn't stay, that perhaps she had the wrong place. But before he could escort her out, the woman took a step backward. Her heel caught on the Persian rug and she fell. The sound of her body hitting the marble floor was muffled by conversations and background jazz music, but loud enough to turn several heads. Time seemed to stop. The woman was on the floor on her side, one hand extended in front of her, eyes closed in pain or shame. Around her, a circle of people watching, but no one moved. Clients at nearby tables observed her with distant curiosity, as one observes an accident that doesn't concern us. Some seemed annoyed by the interruption of their $400 dinner. Others seemed amused by the scene. The servers exchanged embarrassed glances. Helping her would mean interrupting service, drawing more attention to the situation. The maitre d' made a discreet gesture toward two employees who began approaching slowly, without hurry, as if the restaurant's dignity were more important than that. Woman's dignity. Emily was on the other side of the dining room carrying a tray with 3 saffron risotto plates worth a total of $120. She saw the scene through the space between tables. She saw the elderly woman on the floor. She saw everyone looking without doing anything. She saw the faces of the rich laughing, the impassive servers, the maitre d' who seemed more worried about the scandal than about the woman. Something inside her broke. She didn't think about the consequences. She didn't think about the job she couldn't afford to lose. She didn't think about what they would say. She simply reacted. She dropped the tray. $120 of risotto spread across the floor in a golden stain, and she ran toward the elderly woman. The laughter began almost immediately. First quiet, then louder. Emily heard someone say, "Look at this provincial girl," and someone else laugh openly. She knelt next to the woman, ignoring everyone. The elderly lady had her eyes open now, moist with tears of pain and humiliation. Emily spoke to her in a soft voice. She asked if she was okay, where she felt pain, if she could move. The elderly woman looked at her with an expression of gratitude so pure it hurt in the heart. No one had treated her with kindness since she entered that damned restaurant. The maitre d' arrived furious. What was Emily doing? She had dropped 3 plates. Did she know how much they cost? She should return to her service immediately. The employees would handle the situation. Emily ignored him. Gently, she helped the elderly woman sit up. She checked that she had no obvious fractures. She asked again how she felt. The clients around murmured. Some seemed scandalized by Emily's behavior. Others bored by the whole scene. A woman in a Versace dress commented aloud that the restaurant's standards were really falling if they hired such unprofessional staff. Someone laughed again. It was at that moment that the restaurant doors opened violently. A man entered like a hurricane. Tall, perhaps 6'3", athletic build, black hair combed back, groomed beard. He wore a dark gray Armani suit that Emily knew cost more than she earned in 6 months. His eyes were dark, intense, desperate. He frantically looked around the dining room. Then his eyes fell on the scene. His mother on the floor, a young server kneeling next to her helping her, and the entire rest of the restaurant watching as if it were entertainment. The man's jaw tensed. His eyes turned to ice. He crossed the room in 6 long strides. The maitre d' tried to stop him, but he brushed him aside with an arm gesture that brooked no refusal. He knelt next to his mother, saying her name with a voice broken by emotion. The elderly woman smiled seeing him, saying she was okay, that a kind girl had helped her. The man looked at Emily for the first time. Their eyes met, and Emily felt something shake her to her bones. It wasn't just the intensity of his gaze. It was the storm of emotions she saw there. Relief, gratitude, rage. Then he turned to the rest of the restaurant. The maitre d', always ready to recognize power and money, suddenly paled. He stammered something about Mr. Morrison and we didn't know. But Christopher Morrison, because that was his name, CEO of Morrison Empire Group, one of the richest men in America, silenced him with a look. He stood slowly, helping his mother do the same, with Emily supporting from the other side. Then he looked at everyone in the room, the rich clients who had laughed, the servers who had done nothing, the maitre d' who had treated his mother like trash. One by one he stared at them, and each lowered their eyes, unable to hold that gaze. When he spoke, his voice was low, but filled the entire room. He said his mother had Alzheimer's in its early stages. She had gotten confused. She had left the house while he was in a meeting, and he had frantically searched for her for 2 hours. She had entered that restaurant because she remembered he had taken her there years before. She was scared, confused, vulnerable, and they, all of them, had watched her fall as if she were an insect to crush. Everyone, except one person. A server who had dropped her plates, who had ignored her boss, who had done the only right thing in a room full of people who called themselves civilized. Christopher looked at Emily, and in that look there was something beyond gratitude. There was respect, admiration, and something else that neither was yet prepared to recognize. The maitre d' tried to salvage the situation with pathetic apologies, but Christopher interrupted him. He said he would speak with the restaurant owner tomorrow morning. This wasn't over. Then gently he took his mother's arm and prepared to leave. Emily was about to return to her service when Christopher turned to her. He asked her name. "Emily," she whispered. Christopher nodded as if memorizing something important. Then he said something that froze the blood of the maître d' and everyone present. He told Emily not to worry about her job. Tomorrow morning she would receive his call. And to the servers and the maître d' who had laughed or ignored his mother, he said they would also receive news from him, but it wouldn't be a pleasant call. He left with his mother, leaving behind absolute silence. Emily remained there, kneeling on the marble floor, surrounded by spilled risotto, still trembling from adrenaline. The maître d' looked at her with pure hatred and told her she was fired. Emily nodded. She didn't care. She had done the right thing, and in that moment that was all that mattered. Emily returned to her apartment in Queens at 11 p.m., exhausted and emotionally empty. The apartment was tiny, barely 300 square feet, with a single bed, a kitchenette, and a bathroom so small you had to be careful not to bump your elbows. It cost $700 a month, almost her entire precarious server salary. Now she didn't even have that. She sat on the bed, and for the first time in hours allowed herself to feel the panic. How would she pay rent? Her mother in Georgia depended on the money she sent. Her younger sister was in college and needed help. Finding another job in New York without references, with a firing story, it would be impossible. She cried. She cried for the fear, for the stress, for the injustice of it all. But even as she cried, part of her knew she would do the same thing again. That woman needed help, and she had helped her. There was nothing to be ashamed of in that. The next morning at 9 o'clock sharp, her phone rang. "Private number." Emily hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was that of a professional secretary. She was speaking on behalf of Christopher Morrison. Mr. Morrison wished to meet with her today if possible. There was a car that could come pick her up in an hour. Emily stammered something about not understanding, about why, but the secretary was kind but firm. Mr. Morrison would explain everything. Where should she send the car? Emily, still confused, gave her address. When she hung up, she looked at the phone as if it were an alien object. What did America's richest man want from her? She spent the next hour in total panic. What should she wear? Her wardrobe consisted mainly of jeans and t-shirts. In the end, she chose her best jeans, a clean white shirt, and the only decent jacket she owned. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like a student going to a job interview, not someone about to meet a billionaire. The car was a black Mercedes with a uniformed chauffeur. Emily felt ridiculous getting into that vehicle that probably cost as much as 5 years of her rent. The chauffeur was courteous. He didn't ask questions. They drove through New York City, from the narrow streets of Queens to the wide avenues of Midtown, until stopping in front of a historic building on Park Avenue. The building housed the headquarters of Morrison Group. Emily crossed a marble lobby that seemed more like a museum than an office. Modern artwork on the walls, sculptures, floors that reflected like mirrors. The secretary, an impeccably dressed middle-aged woman, guided her to a private elevator that rose without stopping to the top floor. Christopher Morrison's office was exactly as Emily would have imagined it. Enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows showing all of New York City, furnished with taste, minimalist but clearly expensive. And in the center, behind a dark wood desk that seemed carved from a single ancient tree, was him. Christopher stood when she entered. In daylight, Emily could see him better. He was even more attractive than she remembered. Strong features, dark eyes that seemed to read the soul, a presence that filled the room. But there was also something tired about him, a tension around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worries. He indicated an armchair in front of the desk and waited for her to sit before returning to his place. For a moment, no one spoke. Christopher seemed to search for the right words. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. Then he began to speak, and the story he told broke Emily's heart. His mother, Margaret, had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's 2 years ago. It was a progressive disease, and slowly she was losing pieces of herself. Some days she was lucid, remembered everything. Other days she didn't remember where she lived or who her son was. The day before had been one of those bad days. She had gotten confused. She had left the house while he was in a meeting. When Christopher returned and found her missing, he went crazy. He had searched everywhere. He had called the police, the hospitals. He had sent his employees to comb the city. When he finally received a call from someone who had seen her enter the restaurant, he ran there terrified of what he would find. And he found her on the floor, humiliated, surrounded by people who laughed. Everyone, except Emily. Emily, who had dropped her plates, who had ignored her boss, who had treated her with the dignity every human being deserves. Christopher said he would never forget that moment. He said that in a room full of rich, influential people who considered themselves the cream of society, the only person who had shown true humanity had been a precarious server on her third day of work. Emily felt tears rise but held them back. Christopher continued. He said he had called the restaurant owner that morning. The maître d' had been fired. The servers who had left had been fired. He was considering withdrawing his investments from the restaurant completely, but that wasn't why he had called her. He wanted to offer her a job, not as a server, as his mother's personal assistant. Margaret needed someone with her during the day, someone patient, kind, who would treat her with respect even on days when she didn't remember who she was. The salary would be $3,000 a month, plus housing if she needed it, plus all benefits. The only thing that mattered was that his mother was safe and treated well. Emily was speechless. $3,000 a month was more than triple what she earned at the restaurant. With housing included, she could send almost everything home to Georgia, help her mother, pay for her sister's college. But she hesitated. She had no experience caring for people with Alzheimer's. She wasn't qualified. What did she know about caring for someone with that disease? Christopher smiled for the first time, a sad smile. He said he had hired 6 professional caregivers over the course of 2 years, all with impeccable credentials, brilliant references, years of experience. His mother had hated them all, because they treated the job as a job, mechanically, without true empathy. But last night, in 30 seconds, Emily had shown more empathy than all of them combined. He said he would provide all necessary training. She would have access to the best doctors, nurses, resources, but what he couldn't teach, what couldn't be learned from any manual, was how to see humanity in someone, even when that person was losing themselves in the fog of disease. And Emily had that naturally. Emily looked through the windows at New York City spreading below them. She thought of her mother in Georgia, of her sister, of the rent she wouldn't have been able to pay. But she also thought of that elderly woman on the floor, of the eyes full of gratitude when someone had finally treated her like a person. She thought that maybe, just maybe, the universe was giving her a chance not only to save herself, but to do something meaningful. She turned to Christopher and said yes. The first days were difficult. Emily moved to the Morrison estate in Westchester, an enormous property with immense gardens. Margaret had good days and bad days. On good days, she was lucid and fun. On bad days, she didn't recognize anyone and got lost in confused memories. Emily learned to adapt. She didn't contradict when Margaret talked about her husband as if he were alive. She learned that 1960s music calmed her, that she liked old American movies, that the smell of lavender brought her happy memories. Christopher observed everything. His eyes went increasingly to Emily. The way she laughed, how she combed her hair gently, how she took her hand when she was scared. They began to talk, increasingly longer conversations. Emily learned that Christopher had sacrificed everything for the company. No social life, no time for relationships. Christopher learned that Emily sent almost everything home, proud and strong, with a kindness the world hadn't extinguished. Something moved between them. Christopher came home earlier, dined with them, laughed at Emily's jokes. Margaret noticed and said she had never seen her son look at someone like that. 3 months later, Margaret had a nighttime crisis. Emily calmed her with infinite patience, holding her in her arms and singing a southern lullaby. Christopher, awakened by the screams, found them like that. That night they met in the kitchen. Christopher made tea. They sat in silence. Then he thanked her for everything, for having returned dignity to his mother and hope to him. Emily said she was just doing her job, but Christopher disagreed. She truly cared, and that was changing him, reminding him how to feel human. Their eyes met. Christopher leaned in slowly. Their lips touched in a sweet, hesitant kiss, loaded with tension. When they separated, both knew everything had changed. The following weeks were dream and nightmare together. Christopher and Emily tried to maintain distance, but it was impossible. They found themselves making excuses to be together. Margaret watched them with wise eyes, smiling. But not everyone was happy. Christopher's family began to murmur. A server. A girl from the South without a college degree. It was scandalous. The tabloid press sniffed out the story. The headlines were cruel. The Prince and the Cinderella. The server who seduced the billionaire. Comments said Emily was a social climber. Emily read those articles and felt sick. Christopher reassured her, but she knew it had to matter to him. He was the face of a company. Then came Uncle Victor, chief operating officer. He said the relationship was damaging the company, that the board was murmuring, that investors were worried. Christopher firmly threw him out. His private life was his own, but that night Emily said maybe they should stop. It wasn't worth damaging everything he had worked for. Christopher looked at her as if she were crazy. He had spent 10 years building an empire feeling empty. She had given him joy, connection, love. He wouldn't give her up for the approval of people who didn't matter. But the pressure continued. Margaret, in lucid moments, told Emily not to give up. True love was rare. When you found it, you had to fight. The breaking point came during a company gala dinner. Christopher insisted Emily accompany him. Emily bought a modest dress, the only thing she could afford. The night was a disaster. Rich women made comments about her cheap dress. Businessmen treated her condescendingly. Christopher's family was glacial. Emily resisted with dignity, but on returning home she broke down. She said she couldn't continue being the reason he was judged. He deserved someone from his class. She was just a Georgia girl who had cleaned floors. Christopher took her in his arms. He said she was right. She didn't belong to that world. She belonged to a better world, where kindness was worth more than money. And he wanted to be in that world with her. He asked her to marry him, right there, without a ring or prepared speech, just with certainty. He didn't want to spend another day without her. Emily cried and laughed at the same time. She said yes, despite the world, despite judgments, despite everything, because the love they felt was real and could overcome any obstacle. The next day, Christopher held a press conference. He announced the engagement. He said Emily was the woman he loved. Whoever had problems could talk to him. Whoever didn't respect his choice could leave. It was an earthquake. Some resigned. But slowly things changed. Clients wrote letters of support. The story of the server who helped an elderly woman became a symbol that class is measured in character, not money. The wedding was simple. Only close family and true friends in the estate garden where it all began. There was Margaret, lucid and happy, crying tears of joy. There was Emily's family from Georgia, uncomfortable but emotional. And there were true friends, celebrating love. When Emily walked down the improvised aisle, Christopher felt tears fall down his face. This extraordinary woman, who had entered his life by pure chance, who had shown kindness when everyone showed indifference, was choosing him. Despite all the chaos, judgment, pressure, she was choosing him. The vows were simple but profound. Christopher promised to honor her every day, never forget the lessons she had taught him about humanity and kindness. Emily promised to stand by his side, remind him who he really was when the world tried to turn him into someone else. Margaret made a toast that left everyone in tears. She said when she had fallen in that restaurant and everyone had looked at her like trash, an unknown girl had returned her dignity. And that girl hadn't just saved her. She had saved her son, reminded him there were things more important than success and money. She had taught him to love again. The following years brought challenges but also joys. Margaret worsened slowly, but had 2 good years before the end. 2 years when Emily was by her side. When she died, it was peacefully, surrounded by Christopher and Emily holding their hands. Her last lucid words were to thank Emily for having given her son the chance to be happy. Christopher and Emily had 2 children. The first, a boy, they named Peter, after Christopher's grandfather. The second, a girl, they named Margaret in honor of grandmother. The children grew up in an atmosphere of love, but also values. Emily insisted they understand the value of money, that they help others, that they never look down on anyone. The company prospered under Christopher's leadership, who, influenced by Emily, initiated social responsibility programs. They created scholarships for young people from the South. They built centers for elderly people with Alzheimer's. Morrison Group became not only a successful company, but an example of ethical business. And every year, on the anniversary of that fateful night, Christopher and Emily returned to the Golden Pearl restaurant, not to eat, but to remember. Remember where it all began. Remember that fallen woman. Remember that sometimes life's most important moments begin with a simple act of kindness. The restaurant had changed management after Christopher withdrew his investments. The new owner, informed of the story, had put a small discreet plaque near the entrance. It didn't say exactly what had happened, but it had a quote. "True class is measured not in money, but in compassion." Emily sometimes thought about that night, about the decision to drop those plates and run to help. She hadn't thought about consequences. She had just done what felt right. And that decision had changed everything. She had found love, family, purpose. But more than anything, she had proven that in a world that often values the wrong things, kindness still has power. Christopher often told her she had saved him, but Emily knew the truth. They had saved each other. He had given her stability, security, a love she had never dared dream of. She had given him something money couldn't buy. She had made him human again. And it all began because a Georgia girl had seen an elderly woman fall to the floor and, against all logic, against all expectations of a cynical world, had chosen to help. Because sometimes all it takes to change a life is to see another human being in their vulnerability and choose compassion instead of indifference. Like if you believe true class is measured in kindness, not money. Comment what your reaction would have been seeing someone fall in that restaurant. Share this story to remember that humanity is worth more than any bank account. Subscribe for more stories that prove how one moment of compassion can change everything. Sometimes life's most important moments begin with the simplest decisions. Helping someone who has fallen, showing kindness when everyone shows indifference, choosing humanity over convenience. In a world that too often judges people's worth by their bank account or wardrobe, true luxury is having a heart that sees humanity in every person. And sometimes that simplicity is what saves not just one life, but 2 souls searching for each other without knowing it.